Piyush Goyal has said that if Indian companies are not allowed to participate in businesses or opportunities emerging in any country, then India will also not allow those countries to participate in India. He also made a statement in the upper house on Tuesday on India's decision to not join RCEP and said India has not benefited to its expected potential from some of the free trade agreements. He stressed on the need for a balanced market access outcome across all pillars of negotiations, fair trade practices, open market-based operations, and transparency. So for more on this, we're joined by a distinguished panel of guests in the studio today. Let me first introduce the guests, beginning with Mr. Bhanuchandran Nagarajan, former consultant, the World Bank. We also have with us Mr. Santosh Tiwari, Senior Director, FICCI, and Mr. A.K. Bhattacharya, the Editorial Director of Business Standard. Let me begin with you, Mr. Bhattacharya, and let's try and understand this concept of the reciprocal trade policy. All of us know that there are a lot of, tensions around the world amongst all players, be it the larger ones or the not so larger ones, in terms of the trade practices followed by them, most of them bilateral as well. So where does the reciprocal trade policy, I believe it's at the center of this all?
Well, I think reciprocal trade policy is the heart and soul of any trade policy or trade transactions. Essentially, it is the reciprocity that determines a global trading framework. Now, if you look back in time, the World Trading Organization is also based on or premised on the principle of reciprocal gestures, in a sense that if I allow certain countries to export an X number of goods at that duty, so a similar arrangement is expected of the country that is getting that facility. Okay. Now, what has happened of late is that protectionism is on the rise. There are many countries which are raising tariffs. They are creating non-tariff barriers. You have a trade war between the US and China. India too has raised its tariffs in many items. So the question or the principles of a reciprocal trade policy has now come under closer scrutiny and questioning. So the minister's reiteration that India will go by the principles of reciprocal trade policy is actually a reiteration of an age-old tradition in international trade, but its context is very significant. Today, that is December 10th, is also the day when the World Trade Organization will lose its appellate mechanism, in a sense that in a World Trade Organization forum, if I am going to complain against another country's unfair trade practices or dumping of goods at lower tariffs, I can go and appeal against that practice. Now that would be listened to or tried or heard in an appellate body. Okay. Now today is the last day, is when the appellate body can function. From tomorrow, there will be no appellate body under World Trade Organization. In other words, that if I have a grievance against you under WTO norms, I will not be hopeful of a resolution of the situation. So the minister's statement today underlines the basic principle. But at the same time, I would say that when you are introducing reciprocal trade policy and reiterating those norms, it is important to keep in mind the interest of domestic consumers and make sure that domestic industry remains competitive. Okay. So these are the two issues which could be an area of concern, but I think reciprocal trade policy, if implemented in fairness, transparently, I think is not a bad idea. Okay. Let me bring in Mr. Nagarajan here, and two more aspects which I would like to add here are from the minister's statement in the upper house on Tuesday, that is today, and wherein he cited how India has, the trade imbalance between India and the FTA partners has risen over a period of time. Between India and ASEAN, it has risen by around 4 times in the last 6 to 7 years, and with almost all RCEP nations, almost more than a dozen of them, it has risen by around 9 times. So that also signifies the importance of the reciprocity
principle?
Sure. Just quickly responding to Mr. Bhattacharya, the basis of trade between two nations is actually comparative advantage and not reciprocity. But what barriers both tariff and non-tariff do is preventing proper exercise of that comparative advantage. So let me quickly go into a bit of theory on this barriers to trade business. One is, there are two types of barriers to trade. One is tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers. Tariff barriers are very simple to understand. Country X can impose a certain percentage on few goods coming from country Y to protect its own industry and so on. For example, in the beginning of the trade war, US imposed 25% on Chinese steel and 10% on aluminum. Chinese did 25% on pork and soya beans coming from the US. In fact, like 4 days ago, they actually kind of waived that off. So this is tariff barriers. Non-tariff barriers can take multiple forms. They are a bit insidious. It's very hard to understand as well. Non-tariff barriers can be of three kinds. One is like they can be protectionist, in which like the tariff barriers are non-tariff barriers erected such that the local industry is protected at the cost of competing international companies, or it can be assistive in nature, in which just the local companies are subsidized, or sometimes it's non-protectionist. For example, like if there is for example, pork from Africa is not being imported by China because of diseases and so on. So there are different types of barriers. How these non-tariff barriers are actually imposed is through many things, such as, for example, like a particular country might say, like you have to purchase X amount of goods locally. They can say, like you should share the intellectual property with local companies. They'll have separate standards. They have separate inspection mechanisms and so on. So this why I'm giving this background is what Mr. Piyush Goyal spoke about today come under this non-tariff barriers. It's very hard to, for example, in China, you can't actually engage in a procurement process without partnering with a Chinese company, which is a non-tariff barrier, right? For example, like many Indian public projects are open for international bidding. So this creates a scenario in which our comparative advantage is not being able to be expressed. So that is the fundamental nature of this. It's very important that the minister actually put this forward. In fact, I think that he's trying to kind of do a posturing, trying to do a Donald Trump, saying that, if you actually do not do this, like, then we will also cut it off. Like nothing actionable has come out of that so far. But it is a good posture. It's a part of a good negotiation strategy to have, in which you can say that, like India, we are going to grow, we are going very fast, and if you don't give access to our companies, like we are going to block access to your companies as well.
So it does make a lot of sense to try and protect our own interests and the interests of our industry and the other people as well. Let me bring Santosh here. Santosh, from the industry's perspective, and if you look at from both these aspects, as Nagarajan pointed out, the non-tariff barriers as well as tariff barriers. So in both those aspects, reciprocity, the principle, how does it work and how does the industry look at it?
See, whatever India has done in terms of pull out from RCEP, and also the way Mr. Piyush Goyal has outlined India's objective and also the stance, has to be seen from the perspective of what is happening in the geopolitical map of the world. India's strength has increased quite considerably in last 5-6 years in terms of bargaining power. So once you have bargaining power, once you have this capability to say no to certain negotiations, then you come with a position which is that of strength. So what has happened during RCEP negotiation is that India is now coming from a position of strength. So it has said no to RCEP negotiations now. Now what does that mean? That means that if something or some trade instrument is not favoring India over a period of time, then now we are in this position that we will say no to that trade negotiation or that thing. That's one. So you have to understand this aspect, that India's strength in the global power dynamics has changed. So whatever trade negotiations would happen, would be seen in this perspective, that is it benefiting India or not.
And
that
RCEP is one such case.
RCEP is one such case. Now then you go back to the reason. Why is India having this kind of a position? Just because when the FTAs were getting signed in 2010 and 2011, it was thought that they would be helping in maintaining India's trade balance with those countries. In fact, it was thought that it will help India also. But somewhere down the line, the treaties are these FTAs are such that they have ended up hurting India's business, domestic business, and they have ended up increasing trade imbalances, which the minister is pointing out to. So there is a solid reason when India is today saying that reciprocity is the principle on which we would be indulging into trade negotiations. Now, third element, which is also very important and which Mr. Bhattacharya mentioned, is that of weakening of the multilateral trade institution, WTO. So when you have this kind of situation, when you are moving from bilateral trade negotiations, bilateral trade treaties, to treaties where you have to ensure that your national interest is protected, those kind of negotiations where many countries are involved in the negotiation, like RCEP or any other negotiations of
regional
that kind, regional groups, there you have to ensure that your national interest is protected. And then comes this reciprocity principle. Unless until you ensure or you are in a position to ensure that reciprocity is maintained in any of the trade negotiations or deals or treaties, you will again go back to what has happened in terms of FTA. So India's stance today is very clear, and FICCI and all other industry chambers have welcomed the RCEP decision, and they have also mentioned, FICCI President Mr. Sandeep Somani has categorically said that just because India is now in a position and Prime Minister has whatever decision he has taken of pulling out from RCEP shows that now India can care for its national interest, when it comes to trade negotiations. So you have to look at the whole, whole perspective and dynamics which Minister is mentioning repeatedly, taking into these three aspects. A, India is coming from a position of strength. B, FTAs have not helped India and we need to correct it. And C, when multilateral institution like WTO, that's getting weakened, we have to as a country ensure that our interests, national interests are protected. And that is where reciprocity comes in.
One more thing which Mr. AKB initially pointed out, and Santosh, I'd like to, you to respond specifically to that, when he said that, the concerns are that one major concern in this overall aspect would be to address or rather to safeguard the domestic industry.
Yeah, that's correct. If you say domestic industry, then it should not appear like, it is not in national interest. Safeguarding domestic industry is perfectly all right when you take care of the overall national interest. But India has gone ahead of that. Now, what our RCEP position is, that we are not signing RCEP not just because, whatever India wanted has not been met. Just because it's not fair for other countries also. So, in terms of trade negotiations, Indian position has gone ahead of what is national interest. We are saying we will protect our national interest. But the way RCEP negotiations were going on, India's point of view was that not only India's interest, it is not able to protect in the current scenario, the way RCEP negotiations were going on, it will not be able to protect interests of many other countries also. So first of all, you have to bring to the table a mechanism where you think of a larger protection of national interest of all the countries which would be signing that particular
participating
deal.
Countries.
So it has gone one step ahead.
Okay. Mr. Bhattacharya, do you agree with this point which Santosh is making here, that, this shows significantly that India is coming from a position of strength? This posturing and this kind of, sending a message across to everyone that we will not tolerate if our interests are harmed in any way.
Well, I don't entirely agree with this assertion that this suggests that India is coming from a position of strength. And I will expand on that. But before that, I wanted to just add a point to Mr. Nagarajan's thing, that I think trade does thrive on comparative advantages, but reciprocity of trade is a very important element in trade that is buoyant and is growing.
Okay.
So I think what has happened right now, the government's concern is that yes, we may have the comparative advantage, which is debatable, which I'll come to it later, but what we are seeing is that India is not getting the same terms from its trading partners as it wants. So I think that is where Mr. Goyal has made this point, that we want to insist on reciprocal trade policy.
Okay.
Having said that, my sense is that India's position on various international trade platforms, whether it is FTA or the pullout from RCEP, is actually an outcome of long years. It is not just 5-6 years, long years of neglect of India's manufacturing sector. We cannot possibly see trade as distinct from the manufacturing sector. If you have not developed a strong manufacturing sector, making it competitive, making sure that the factors of production, which is land, labor, capital, they are competitive on a global scale. Forget about factor market or land, labor, capital, but also about trade facilitation. How are your ports? Are you efficient there? Now, if you do not take care of this large number of issues, you cannot expect that India can be on an international global trading platform where it can actually withstand competition from the world.
Okay.
So therefore, I am not sure whether India is going and saying no to RCEP from a position of strength, or is it coming from its recognition that at this point in time, domestic competitiveness is not good enough to take on the onslaught of imports that will open up if you sign on to RCEP.
Okay.
So having said that, the real concern to my mind here is to what extent will the consumer choice as a result of such reciprocal trade policy can be impaired. My sense is that the moment the Indian market becomes closed behind the walls of tariff and behind the policy of reciprocal trade policy, the fear is that the domestic consumers' choice may get restricted.
Okay.
And that's an area of concern, and which is why I said it has to be seen in an integrated way. If you cannot improve manufacturing competitiveness, trade will be affected, and if trade is affected, domestic choice of consumers will also be affected.
Okay, so the larger perspective here is which brings consumers also in the focus. Nagaraj, your view on that. The overall holistic view. It's not only about domestic industry. It's not only about we setting our terms or asking for equal terms. It's also about the consumers at the end of the day, and also ensuring efficiency of our entire ecosystem.
Absolutely, like you hit the nail on the head. I'll just come to that conclusion through a circuitous route, which will tie up with what Mr. Bhattacharya was saying. In fact, the crux of what what the Commerce Minister told today was based on comparative advantage. We have a comparative advantage in services, okay, compared to manufacturing, which is still developing, or which is still a work in progress. In fact, the RCEP negotiations broke down because services was not included in the deal. Okay, if you look at the trade between India and ASEAN, if you look at manufacturing, India imports around like $59 billion worth of goods. And exports around $38 billion worth of goods. But when it comes to services, India exports 24 billion and imports only 21 billion. So we have an advantage there. So this is the crux of the matter. In fact, like when Mr. Goyal was talking about Indian companies' access to foreign projects, he was basically talking about services. Okay. So, but having said that, coming to your point, it is important that we we actually take a balanced perspective. As I was mentioning in my previous comments, I think this is a part of posturing or a public, a part of a negotiating strategy. Like with many things in public policy, it is not black or white, it's a shade of grey, and we have to choose that shade of grey that suits us. So what if we actually impose these restrictions, okay, on foreign companies coming and participating in a public procurement? The disadvantage would be, like, we get actually capital, we actually get knowledge, we get technology in our projects. Our companies learn from it. So probably, like, they have the skill sets to do the projects faster, which is going to affect the consumer, which is good for the general public, but it involves a certain bit of giving away of a certain number of privileges. Okay. But if you come to if you look at the other side, if we actually do this and are successful in the negotiations, Indian companies will go out. Okay, they will actually learn new technologies. They will access new markets. Okay, they will actually become better companies, more expanded companies. So there is this element of a pro and a con included, and we should actually choose that strategy that kind of fits us very well.
Okay.
So this is coming to the services bit, but yeah, go ahead. You wanted to ask something.
Okay.
else.
No, I wanted to bring Santosh here, since it's all about the overall picture, the holistic picture, and as Mr. AKB also brought in the consumer angle, and as Nagarajan is pointing out, the services is also a very important aspect out here. It's not only about the manufacturing sector.
Yeah, that's correct, but everybody needs to understand that, the whole global trade dynamics is going through a transitory phase. India's posturing and what India is doing is, in terms of what you said, is in the overall context, and it should be seen that way. Consumers will find markets and markets will find consumers. Now you have reached to a situation in global trading pattern or global trading system where no one can stop this, They will find each other, But having said that, I was mentioning a larger point. Now, this transition is not that of 1 year or 2 years. This transition is happening for a decade. When WTO is weakening, then you were looking for some alternative arrangement, and those alternative arrangements were FTAs, bilateral trade practice, bilateral trade deals, and also some kind of regional or maybe 2, 3, 4 countries together, those kind of deals.
Okay.
Those things happened. They have not worked in India's favor. That's for sure. Now you are looking at a stance. This is a transitory phase. India is not saying that India will not ever sign, any trade deal, any trade pact. It's not the case. But India's interest is also there in services, as Mr. Chandra mentioned. Then you have other interests also.
Okay.
Not only services. There are areas, where India has competitive advantage. Manufacturing, Mr. Bhattacharya rightly pointed out, in manufacturing we need to increase our competitiveness. So it's a transitory phase. We have products and services where we need to go forward. India is saying that yes, all the countries with which we are going to have a trade deal, they must respect our concerns, national interest and everything, Okay. That is the reason, why Mr. Piyush Goyal is taking this posture, and this is what is the posture which has been taken after a lot of deliberation and consultations.
Okay.
Hard bargaining has happened at RCEP, and you had good bargainers.
But would you agree with what Mr. AKB earlier said, that, at the same time, while all this is happening, we will also have to, build upon our capabilities in terms of our entire ecosystem to have that competitive edge, for our domestic industry, for the products they ultimately make.
There is no denying the fact that, Vishal, that India has to increase its competitive advantage, it has to focus, manufacturing has to focus on competitive advantages. But having said that, it's not something, which will happen over 1 year or 2 years.
Both things will go hand in hand.
It has to be a transitory phase. India is trying its level best. A lot of things have happened. Ease of doing business rankings have improved. They have not improved, something has been done and they have improved.
Okay.
But yes, Mr. Bhattacharya is right that competitive advantage has to come. And when that comes, then you will have your own essential, advantage. But prior to that, what do?
Okay.
You have to protect your interest.
Okay.
And you have to have this kind of posture.
Okay. Concluding words from you, Mr. Nagarajan, but 30 seconds, I'm running short of time.
Absolutely. See, since 2009, the research points out that 20%, only 20% of trade barriers erected are tariff barriers, rest are non-tariff barriers. India wants to increase its share of world exports from 2% to 3.5%. That's the stated policy of the government. In fact, like our trade with ASEAN is going to be doubled from 142 billion to 300 billion by 2025. So we are actually going to be a big player. Keeping this in mind, the minister rightly pointed out that non-tariff barriers such as reciprocal access should be cut down. It should be made easy for Indian companies to operate elsewhere. So it makes absolutely pragmatic sense.
Okay, so there it is, explained in detail, or rather the holistic view or holistic perspective of the principle of reciprocity as far as trade is concerned between two nations or in a regional grouping also. There will be a lot of developments and negotiations on this aspect, and we'll keep you updated on all of them. We'll also come back tomorrow with a different topic and different set of guests. Till then, keep watching Rajya Sabha Television.